It's obviously a great pleasure to have Abuna Paul with us tonight. Abuna Paul يعني is originally Winnipegger, and he's an engineer originally as well by trade. He's a lovely priest, and he is a student doing lots of theological study. So basically everybody can relate and connect to Abuna Paul. And more than that, his personality is he's a very youth oriented person that really youth love to talk to and connect to, and just even to have a cup of coffee with, or maybe join in a car ride where you actually have to have the guts to keep up with the laughs and all of that. So Abuna Paul is with us tonight to bless us in a lovely talk, to put some peace in our heart and comfort in our mind. تفضل.
Thank you so much for the wonderful intro, undeserved, and thank you everyone. And before we start this evening, I have a few questions, just to get our minds in the right place. Why are fish so smart? Why are fish so smart? I see Karas is smiling. I don't know if he knows the answer or...
I don't know that.
Because they live in schools. Yeah, it's going to be that kind of talk, unfortunately.
That's like
What did the traffic light say to the car? What did the traffic light say to the car? Don't look, I'm about to change.
Is that some sort of dad's talk أو حاجة أو dad's joke أو كده ولا إيه؟
Yeah, I can't tell you where I get them from.
He's the king of dad jokes.
Yes.
It's Google's fault, it's not my fault. And the last one before we get started, why can't Cinderella play soccer?
Lost her
She's
shoes.
always running away from the ball.
Okay.
It's true. And speaking of soccer, we did very well in the World Cup for clubs recently. Lately, I don't know if anybody's watching or following, but we did pretty good. We didn't lose by that much, so that's obviously good. So we'd like to talk to you about today. Before we start, tell you a short story. It's about a young man from Egypt. He's about 18 years old. They recently bumped into him on the beach, one of the beaches in Egypt, and some news crew caught up with him, and they started to ask him about his life and what he's doing. And he told them his name is Ibrahim Abdel Nasser. It's a true story. And he got 99.6% as his final grade in high school. And this grade determines which program and which university you get into. So this is obviously a very good grade. He can pretty much do whatever he wants. And he is the oldest of three. And he works part-time by selling things, snacks, homemade things on the beach to help his family. He comes from a poor family, so to help his family financially, along with his schooling, which he's doing very well in also. So you can imagine someone like that probably has a lot of excuses, a lot of reasons to make excuses. If you wanted to make an excuse and say, you know what, I've been dealt a bad hand, I don't really have what it takes, the circumstances, look at what other people have. You know, he could have made 1,001 excuses to say, you know what, I'm not going to make it, I'm not going to work hard, but he didn't let any of this stop him. And he went for it, and he did what he wanted to do, and he did very well. And in fact, he inspired a lot of people, and even a lot of rich people. And he got a lot of support and sponsorship to pay for his college tuition, which is very good and very encouraging. And this past year has been sort of a test for a lot of us. If we're of the personality that easily succumbs into difficult circumstances and is willing to make excuses for not doing something, not trying hard, whatever may be, this past year has given us a lot of material to work with, right? It was too hard, it was too difficult, we're locked down, we can't see people, we can't go outside, a lot of reasons, a lot of excuses. But the good news, if you made it through this past year, you can handle anything. Like anything that comes your way from now on for the rest of your lives, you guys are set. You've been through the worst. And the reason now that you'd be able to not really make excuses and go for it, whatever it might be, is that you've overcome this fear, of this certain fear of handling these difficult situations, these difficult moments in life. And if history taught us anything, it's that the absolute worst things in life happen when you have cowards in charge. When you have a coward in charge, you have really, really terrible things taking place, and no one does anything. No one says anything because you have a coward in charge. Just look at Pontius Pilate. He was afraid, he was worried to lose his position and possessions, and he said nothing, or did nothing. He said, this man is innocent, and I know he's innocent, but I'm too afraid that these people are going to go complain about me, and I might lose my position, I might lose favor in the sight of Caesar, and he might bring someone else. So because of that fear, he really allowed this terrible, terrible thing to take place. So if I can summarize what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is that we shouldn't be afraid, we should be fearless. We shouldn't let fear dictate what we can and cannot do. Because once you start making space for fear, once you start compromising, fear takes over. And it tells you what you can and cannot do. And in fact, when it says you cannot do something, you feel paralyzed, you feel unable to move, unable to think, unable to even comprehend you doing something that you're too afraid to do. And because of how powerful fear can be, the very first words spoken when Christ was born were what? Very first words.
Peace on earth.
Do not be
Afraid.
Do not be afraid to the shepherds in the field. Do not be afraid, because this is essentially what was driving people in the Old Testament. Fear of everything. Fear of the unknown, fear of tomorrow, fear of the stranger, fear of death, fear of God, fear of Satan, fear of sin. Just fear was driving everything. And you can see it in their actions and in their words, in their decisions. And it was all about fear. But the incarnation itself gave us the solution to this fear. If God is with us, who can be against us? And Emmanuel is God with us, God amongst us. So being fearless is really the only way to live as a Christian. If there's anything opposite to Christianity, antithetical to the message of Christ, it's being afraid. And if there is this one thing that we can all agree that we need work on, it's this, to get over fear. But I'm not going to tell you things that you hear and you often hear, like, do not be afraid to miss out. Do not be afraid, and this past year we all missed out, ironically. Do not be afraid to turn off your phone or end a toxic relationship. I'm going to try to take it a little bit deeper and really try to tackle things that we're all afraid of, or we can be afraid of, and they have a really big impact. And if we can only get over these fears, we will see huge differences in our lives. The first thing is to not be afraid to trust our lives to God. Do not be afraid to trust your life to God. And it might sound trivial at first. What do you mean, like, trust my life to God? Of course I trust God. But as it turns out, we only trust God when nothing really significant is on the line. If I tell you, do not trust God with, do not be afraid to trust God with a decision like what you're going to wear tomorrow or the weather this weekend. Like, I trust God, everything will be okay. But when it comes to really big decisions like a career, marriage, finance, trusting God takes on a new character, and we become afraid to do it. So if we can only figure out how not to be afraid to do this, to trust our lives to God. And the first way to begin working on this is not to be afraid to follow God, not to be afraid to follow Him. And we hear a lot about Christ and how He did things and how He spoke and how He acted and how He thought and what He told us to do, and He told us to follow Him. And we talk the talk, but following Him is more like a Sunday thing. Monday is for business. Monday it's about getting down and serious, about advancing yourself in life, about making yourself more presentable to a spouse, to business, to schools, to whatever. So, Sunday school is for Sunday, but Monday we're back to business. And in fact, it's that time once we leave church is the most important time to begin really living this and following God. If you can imagine, God comes to you out of nowhere and tells you, I want you to leave everything you've ever known, every form of safety and security you've ever known, and go out into the wilderness, into the wild where there's no safety and there is no security. And you will need to depend on me for everything. Safety, security, food, drink, shelter, everything, companionship, everything. This is exactly what God told Abraham. God told him, I want you to leave your father's house. And Abraham was from a wealthy family. And leaving your father's house is not something that they did. Like you stay and you make the house bigger and stronger, and there's strength in numbers, and there is weakness and death in being alone and separated and isolated, especially in the wilderness. The wilderness is a place where things go to die. And then this God comes out of nowhere. He's not even the God of his fathers, of Abraham's fathers. But he comes to Abraham and says to him, I want you to leave your father's house and come follow me into the wilderness. And I will make a covenant with you. I will be your God, and I will make your offspring, your descendants, as numerous as the sand of the sea. And obviously, this is a huge claim, but it takes a lot of trust from Abraham to be able to do this. And this is exactly the kind of trust we need to live up to. I mean, we need to work up to, meaning that you leave everything you depend on, even your own rationality at times, and trust in God. And trust in God when everything, all your senses are telling you, you should be scared, you should be afraid. Learn to trust in God and learn to use discernment in the way that you're always able to put everything in God's hands. Do not be afraid to follow God. Do not be afraid to live by principle. Do not be afraid to live by principle. This is easier said than done, and it's usually something that comes with the idealism of youth. Younger people like yourselves, and like Abuna and myself, of course, we're idealistic, and we like to think in terms of principles and right and wrong. And then as you grow a bit older, you start to realize that life is more complicated than that. And there's enormous pressure to compromise on your principles. And you know what? You need to make these kinds of compromises to make the ship, move and keep going, and all sorts of things. You need to make compromises in order to fit in. You need to make compromises in order to advance in life. And compromise after compromise after compromise, and you find yourself left with nothing recognizable, because you've compromised away every bit of identity that you used to see in the mirror and be proud of and be happy to see. So do not be afraid to live by principle. That means that there will be a price to pay, for sure. There will be a price to pay, but it's a price worth paying. Because at the end of the day, whatever it is you compromised for is never ever gonna be worth the same as what you compromised, as what you gave up. So in order for you to be able to let go of this fear of trusting in God, first you have to put this idea in your mind not to be afraid to follow Him. God is not just there to follow Him when there's nothing else to do, or God's not there to follow Him when you're in church, or not to follow Him when you're among other Christians. God is there to follow, and we're supposed to follow Him all the time. And the second way to get over this fear is not to compromise on principle. Don't be afraid to live by principle. And finally, do not be afraid to be a disciple. Don't be afraid to be a disciple. The impetuousness of youth makes us think that we know everything. By 16 years old, I already knew everything I needed to know. I mean, I had my car license. I can Google anything I wanted to Google, and well, Google wasn't around back then, but you know what I mean. And as you grow older a little bit, you start to think that maybe I don't know everything. Maybe I need to follow and to learn. And there's a certain level of humility that comes with learning. The more you learn, the more you realize that you know very little. And it's easy to kind of have this boldness to speak about your faith. Yeah, I'm Christian, I'm Coptic Orthodox, I know everything there is to know about Christianity. But the more you learn, the more you realize there's so much more that I need to learn. And this humility, it's not a sense of despair that I don't know anything, but it's a sense of humility, that it humbles you to know that I know very little, but I'm following and I'm being discipled. I'm following in the footsteps of those who came before me, in the tradition that is laid before me and is handed to me. And it's my responsibility to follow this tradition and to hand it down. Do not be afraid to trust your life to God. This might sound a bit trivial, but if we can really get this nailed down, we will begin to see our lives transformed and transfigured in ways that we didn't think were possible. Peace will come and live in our hearts. Anxiety will have no place to dwell within us. Do not be afraid to trust your life to God. The second point is, and this might sound cliche, do not be afraid to fail. Do not be afraid to fail. We have this deep-seated fear to fail, to look bad in front of others, to look bad in front of a colleague, a co-worker, a parent, a friend. And this fear to look bad drives us to do some really unhealthy things. I mean, especially in university, we lie and we cover and we make up stories and do all sorts of things in order to look good. In order to look good in front of our parents, in front of our friends, our colleagues. We just don't want to look bad. And Christianity itself is based on this idea that if you do fail, there is a way to fix this. Repentance. It's not that you're expected not to fail, but you're expected to get back up again. And this is what repentance is all about. This idea where you go and you confront and you learn from what happened and you move on, you carry on. And when we see that this idea of failure is not something to be feared, not something to run away from, then it begins to give us a certain kind of boldness to go and to try and to do things without having this fear looming over our heads. This gives us the boldness to be creative, to try something new, to try something different. And it takes a lot of courage to be creative but it also takes someone created in the image of God. Creativity is all about this image of God being lived out in our lives. Being creative is essentially what being in the image of God, or part of it at least, is all about. Being creative, trying something different, trying something new. It's not that I have to distinguish between, learning from those who came before me, from what they did right, from what they did wrong, what worked, what didn't. But I'm not going to let the fears of other people constrict or limit what I am going to do, or what I'm going to try to do. You hear about people who have a problem for every solution. We're not going to let that stop us. We're not going to be afraid to fail, because even if I fail, it means I tried, and I'm going to continue to work, and I'm going to continue to improve. Do not be afraid to try where others have failed. Do not be afraid to try where others have failed. And this is really important, because fear is something that we learn. We're not born with it. Kids are fearless. I have a couple of kids of my own, and I have to watch them all the time, because they're going to do things that, that's going to hurt them. But we also have to be careful as parents not to teach them to be afraid of things, not to teach them our fears. We have to teach them, of course, to be careful and to be aware of danger. But this fear is something that is taught. And when you are parents yourselves, you'll see that it's very important not to teach your kids how to be afraid of things, how to be bold. And in that sense, we also have to acknowledge that we learn to be afraid of certain things. And because of this, we have to work hard on overcoming these fears, and not to let these fears control, dictate, or paralyze. And finally, do not be afraid to take on challenges. The hard road, the difficult road, the narrow road. Christ talked about this road and said that this road is the road that leads to life. The easy road does not lead to life. In fact, it leads away from it. And we shouldn't be afraid to take on these challenges. Oh, it's too hard to read this book. It's too hard to learn this hymn. It's too hard to study this. But we should not be afraid, really, to take on these challenges. The disciples themselves were great examples of this. The disciples, they left everything that was familiar to them, their fishing careers, and they went and they followed someone who was very controversial, someone who made their lives more dangerous. But at the end, they told them, "Where would we go? We left everything to follow you. Where you go, we go." So do not be afraid to take on challenges. And once you learn to master this, you'll see how liberating it is, how freeing it is. And so we said the first thing, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to follow or trust your life to God. The second is, do not be afraid of failure. And the third, and this might seem again very trivial, but it's very important. Do not be afraid to be yourself. Do not be afraid to be yourself. Our community, like a lot of immigrant communities, image is very important to us, and reputation is very important to us, and we do a lot of things to make sure that our image looks a certain way. And because of this, we make tons of sacrifices. Some of these sacrifices are good and are important, but some of these sacrifices are harmful to the extent that we ignore pain, we ignore needless pain and suffering and mental health problems for the sake of protecting this image. So not being afraid to be yourself is a huge load off your chest, meaning that you're not supposed to conform to this image that's superimposed on you and live and look a certain way, and you know what, if you're not a doctor, a pharmacist, a lawyer, an engineer, then you're a failure. No, absolutely not. Do not be afraid, first of all, to ignore negativity. You're going to see that a lot of people when whenever you open up to them, they begin by being negative, because and it's probably not some coming out of some bad place or maliciousness or bad intention, but they probably want to help you, so they want to save you some heartache, so they tell you how things didn't go well. Because when things don't go well, this is associated with very strong emotion, and it registers as a very vivid memory, and whenever we're recalling, this is what we remember, these very intense feelings. So it's natural to start by being negative. So, but don't be afraid to ignore this negativity, because just because something didn't work for someone doesn't mean it won't work for you. And just because someone or someone's ideal is a certain way doesn't mean that you need to live up to this ideal. The second point is, do not be afraid to let go of doubt. Doubt is something that is healthy. Doubt is something that means you're growing. But in order for you to grow, just like when you're a baby and you use the pacifier, you need to be able to let go of the pacifier in order to continue to grow. You need to let go of the things that you needed as a sort of a crutch when you were younger in order for you to grow. Doubt is something to be addressed, not to be feared, not to be ashamed of either. Doubt is naturally comes to all of us, to everyone, and it's a sign of a deepening of faith. So when you find that there is doubt in your heart about something, it's not something to run away from or be ashamed. Thomas doubted, and Christ didn't rebuke him, but addressed the doubt. And if Thomas didn't let go of this doubt after it was addressed, then he wouldn't have been able to go on and do a lot of great work in years following. And finally, do not be afraid to take your time. Being yourself means that you take things on your own schedule. And especially for university students, for some reason we always try to finish as fast as possible, because the faster, the sooner we finish, for some reason this equates to us being more successful, and it doesn't. It just means that we're missing out on a lot of important things because we're rushing to get through whatever it is that we're doing. Take your time. If you're doing a degree that takes 4 years and you do it in five, that's absolutely fine. It's not a big deal at all. You're going to be competing with people that you would be competing with another group of people if you finished a year earlier. So it doesn't really mean that there won't be any competition or that you're going to be ahead of the curve somehow. Take your time and learn to just slow down and breathe. And once you learn to do this, once you learn to kind of not set your own schedule based on other people's expectations, you'll begin to notice that there's a lot of important stuff that you can benefit from, and a lot of growing and growth that can happen simply because you slowed down. That's the only thing. Slowing down. That's all you need to do. So as you can see, there are a lot of sides to this whole idea of not being afraid. We're always pushed to conform to a certain to a certain image and to live a certain way. Some of this is healthy and protective, but some of this isn't healthy. Some of it is in fact harmful. When we don't take our time to examine how we live and why we do the things that we do, we inadvertently take in things that aren't healthy, that aren't helpful, and we pass these things on to future generations, to our children, to our children's children, to Sunday school kids, when we go and serve in Sunday school. So it's very important to take a step back and examine and look within to see if there's any fear that resides within. And I'm sure we can all find some sort of fear to work on. And if we address it, I'm sure we'd be able to improve things drastically. At this point, I'm going to stop talking, and if anyone has any comments or questions.
Thank you, Abuna. That was really, really lovely. And I think all of us need that nowadays, Abuna, to have that message engraved I know that some people might not like always to say, well, this was repeated in the Bible how many times and so forth. But one of the lovely, fascinating things about do not be afraid, that the phrase was repeated in the Bible maybe 365 times. Some people will look at that and say, well, maybe God is telling us, do not be afraid every single day. So when we wake up in the morning, with good morning everybody, he would say, do not be afraid. And it is repeated every single day throughout the year. We have the habit to ask people to share by a question or a comment. So if your reverence allow, can we do that?
Absolutely.
طيب Andrew, would you like me to do that or would you like to lead that activity?
You can do it, Abu Bakr.
طيب يا حبيبي. احنا عندنا كريستين واصف.
Thank you so much, Abuna, for the talk. I loved it so much. Thank you.
طيب ديانا.
Hi, Abuna, peace and grace. Thank you so much for the talk. It was great, especially the part about that each one has a different timeline, and I feel like we're always so pressured to almost kind of just be competing in a certain timeline, especially in our community. So this is kind of nice to just take a step back and trust in God's plan and not be afraid. Thank you so much.
Thank you, حبيبي. Doris.
Hi, Abuna. Thank you so much for this talk. I think it's a hard topic, especially when you talked about like in school and university, how we're always trying to rush. Because I know I always think that way. So because of the fear that's always there that you have to finish in a certain time frame. So thank you for that reminder.
Maria Gindi.
Thank you so much, Abuna, for the talk. I really enjoyed it. It was very reassuring. I do have a quick question. I just want to know, practically speaking, what can we do to practice this fearlessness in our lives?
That's a very good question, and I hope I addressed some of it in the talk, but I'll say a few more words. Obviously, knowing yourself is a big part of it. We all think highly of ourselves and think that there's no way fear can control how I do things or how I think or my decisions or all that, but in fact it has a big part, and this whole COVID situation has showed us how much fear can impact our decisions and our thinking and our interactions. I mean, toilet paper, of all things, for people to hoard and to buy in large quantities and to just be afraid that, toilet paper, right? And this is the absurdity of fear. This is how far fear can drive you to do really irrational, crazy things. So addressing that and understanding that I'm a human being, and if I let fear reign free and go unchallenged, then there's really no limit to how far it will go. It will take over. In fact, it will not just stay within one area or around one issue. It will take over. Every part of your life will be dictated by fear. The only things I would be allowed to do or permitted to do are the things I'm not afraid of. And this is the one of the first steps is really to acknowledge that fear, if unchecked, can take over, and all of us are vulnerable to fear. So I'm going to repeat quickly the 3 points. Is do not be afraid to trust your life to God. When you begin to really take this seriously and not just as a matter of a model, but take it seriously and try to apply it and see, am I really afraid to let my life be in God's hand to follow Him? Then you'll begin to see the areas or the issues that you're really afraid of. And once you identify certain issues, this is where you have to work. You have to address them. You cannot just ignore it. Like For example, if you find a snake in your bed, it's not like, you'd be able to just turn around and just go to sleep. You can't. It will bite you. You have to address it. You have to take care of it. You have to get it out. Sorry for the scary image, but this is exactly the same thing. You find that you're afraid of something, don't turn your back on it. This is your duty to address it, to work on it, get help, get guidance, and work on it, and don't stop until you get there.
Thank you, Abuna. Mireille Iskandar.
Hi, Abuna. Thank you so much for the talk. I think it's really relevant during this time, especially because it's quite easy to be afraid and to be fearful. So I guess we just kind of have to fight against those feelings like you were talking about. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Habibi. Nicole.
Hey, Buna, I wanted to say thank you as well, and I really want to echo what Doris was saying in terms of just this talk being a really good reminder in terms of going back to basics of how we can look at just our lives in COVID, but even just our everyday lives. So I really appreciate this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Habibi. Solomon.
Thank you, Buna. I really enjoyed the talk, especially with the relevance the topic has for both today and in any stage in our lives. Thank you.
Yusab.
Thank you, Buna, for the talk. I did have two questions that were kind of going around in my head while you know, giving your talk. One was like, are there times when I guess we should heed the fear? I mean, sometimes, like you mentioned, kids are fearless, but we of course have to teach them a little bit of fear. We have to teach them at least caution, right? They can't run out in the middle of the street. They have to fear the car coming at them. So, how do we guess, like, in a way, like, work without fear to kind of spot difference between something I have to be bold and work my way through and something that, I actually have to, this is maybe God warning me that something maybe bad will happen if I, pursue my course of action. And my second question is, and I guess it's kind of related to the first, how do we maintain a constant communication through God and, like, be able to make it like a two-way street, not just us talking, but us listening to Him and being able to get that contact? Because as you mentioned, Abraham. When Abraham went out into the wilderness, he didn't go out alone. God was with him, and He was talking to him. He told him to sacrifice Isaac, but He also told him to not kill Isaac. You talk about like someone like Elijah, when he was afraid after Jezebel put like a bounty on his head, God spoke to him, but in a whisper. So how, any practical advice on like hearing that whisper?
So the first question, I'm going to give you an extreme example to kind of make the point clear. Death. Death is something that a lot of people are afraid of. And because they're afraid of, they don't live. They're always living in the fear of death, the fear of dying. And because of this, they don't appreciate life. They don't experience life. They don't understand life. It's all about making life as long as possible, delaying death as much as possible. But it's not about giving meaning to every moment and making the best out of every moment. So when we look at the way God deals with humanity, I would argue that it's never through fear. It's not like God scares you into something, but it's this meaningful awareness of the presence of God that is always the intention behind every word, every action, every decision that God makes. So being aware that you can be harmed by something is different than, and making a decision based on, not crossing the street when a car is coming is different than being afraid. Because believe it or not, there are people who have these types of fears that are to the extent that they're phobias and they're pathologies. They're paralyzing. People are afraid to cross the street Like imagine you trying to cross the street, or someone with that kind of level of fear trying to cross the street but just unable to. The whole body feels frozen and unable to just take that step and step into the intersection to cross. That's the kind of fear that is paralyzing. That's the kind of fear we really need to address and not make any space or room for. But being awareness of danger or harm is not in the same sense as being afraid of it. And this is what we teach kids, or we ought to teach kids, is that we need to be careful and need to be smart, but not afraid. And fear is kind of like anxiety, is kind of like guilt. The results of it are not good. It's not what you would expect. It's not like fear makes you a more careful person. Fear makes you a more cowardly person. Guilt or anxiety doesn't help, with repentance. It just drives you further down the hole of sin, and it makes you a weaker person, that more liable to fall into temptation and sin and so forth. So I wanted, and it's a great question, to distinguish between fear and awareness and discernment and so forth. Now the second question, can you repeat it again, please?
The second question is, I guess, any practical tips on staying in communion with God as you kind of go through confronting your fears and tribulation? How can we kind of, hear God and kind of get advice from Him about how to live our life through the fear, I guess?
Yes. And I'm going to give you the short answer and then a bit of a longer answer. Let go of any misconceptions about God, and then you'll begin to hear His voice. Now, a short story. There was this prophet in the Old Testament who had these ideas about God and who He is and how He should be and act, and how people should believe in Him and so forth. So he set up this contest. Elijah the prophet. He set up this contest between God and the priest, himself, obviously being the prophet of God, and the priest of Baal, this other deity from a neighboring culture. And they said, we're going to have a showdown, and the winner will be revealed as the true God. Either God will be God and you worship Him, or Baal is God and you worship him. So after setting up this contest, fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice of Elijah, but the sacrifice of the priest of Baal, nothing happened. So he thought that this is going to work and everyone is going to repent and turn from their wickedness and idol worship. And he's talking to Israelites here. And idol worship and go and follow God. And when this didn't work, what he did was he walked and walked and walked and walked 40 days and 40 nights until he got to a place where he knew that once upon a time a man stood in the presence of God and spoke with God. And his thinking is, if that first thing didn't work, maybe the second thing, I'm going to go ask God why this didn't work. Why, God, the big show of strength didn't work. And when he got there, it was Mount Sinai. When he got there, he stood where Moses stood and he spoke with God and asked him, this happened, and why didn't it work? And God explained to him through a couple of times, and then he did it a third time in a way that makes it perfectly clear. God is not simply speaking in the big fire and the storm and the earthquake and mountain shattering wind, but God was speaking in a small, still whisper, in a very silent whisper, almost you can't hear it. But his expectation, he was always waiting to hear God in the big, in the powerful, in the big fireworks show. But because he wasn't looking for the whisper, he missed it completely, right? And he went and told him, go back to where you came from, and basically I'll take care of it. and he showed him that the people of God aren't just who you see as the people of God, as the Israelites. There are people who within Israel who have not committed idolatry and started worshiping other gods. There are people in other nations that are part of God's plan, and basically your whole conception, idea of God is based on not who God revealed himself to be, but on your own conceptions of God. And we need to let go of that in order to be able to hear God. Prayer, for example, is not simply just you giving a list of demands to God and letting him know certain things at certain times of the day. Prayer in its purest form is the realization that you are in the presence of God. In 2 Thessalonians, when St. Paul talks about prayer, he says, pray unceasingly. Pray all the time. How can you pray all the time? How can you pray when you're eating, when you're driving, when you're going to work, when you're in school, in the lecture? How? Right? If we understand prayer to be that realization that you are in the presence of God, you can do everything prayerfully. There's the story about this old man who used to spend a lot of time in church, and this young man came to him and told him, you must have a lot to ask of God. And he said, not really. So the young man told him, well, why do you spend a lot of time in prayer? What do you do? And he said, nothing. I just sit there looking at him, and he sits there looking at me. Being in the presence of God, this is prayer. All the other times we do pray is to help the mind realize that it is in the presence of God. And once we forget this or ignore this, this is when we fall into temptation and fall in sin. So hearing God's voice, knowing God's will, a lot of the time we don't hear God's voice is because we have this idea of who God is, who God should be, and God's looking at this and like, that's not who I am. That's not how I work. So we need to let go of these ideas and go back and read and understand. And our tradition is so rich that it really takes us by the hand, step by step, in order to tradition isn't just a thing that's handed down from generation to generation. It's something. It's like a verb. It works on us. So we are tradition. We're shaped by it. So it shapes us into this into this Christian person, where you begin to understand God's revelation to humanity.
Thank you. Thank you, Abu. Minerva?
Thank you, Abuna, so much. It was very compelling, and I just wanted to kind of repeat what Murray said about how this is very relevant to what we're going through, like how it's so easy to be fearful, and like as you said, you have to, control that fear before it controls you. So yeah, thank you so much.
Lovely. Andrew?
Thank you, Abuna. I think I really resonated with the fact about the toilet paper. It's more than just about toilet paper, but it's it's about like just the fact that fear tends to make us do really crazy, stupid things, and we don't think about it for a second. But then I guess kind of a little question to add on to that is like, in terms of like our relationship with God, is there a different kind of fear? Because like, in the liturgy, it says worship God in fear and trembling, which sounds kind of like a bit scary.
That's a great point. I should give a whole lecture on that, and there's a huge difference between fear, in the sense of being afraid, and the fear of God. And I'm going to read something to you quickly. Slow computer.
Take your time, Abu.
So, in The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis, think a lot of people are familiar with his writings. He says your feelings, in distinguishing between fear, as in being afraid, and the fear of God. The fear of God is not the same thing as being afraid of a tiger, for example, which is fear based on the knowledge of danger. Fear of God is like your feelings would then be even less like the mere fear of danger, but the disturbance would be profound. You would feel wonder and a certain shrinking, a sense of inadequacy to cope with such a visitant and of prostration before it. An emotion which might be expressed in Shakespeare's words, under it my genius is rebuked. This feeling may be described as awe, and the object which excites it as the numinous. So this idea of fear being confronted with a mystery so wonderful that it rebukes your ego, your whole being, your whole mind. Before it, you have nothing to respond with but awe. So that's fear and trembling. Abuna Tedros Malti also has a few words about fear and trembling. He says in one of his commentaries, I think the Epistle to the Philippians, he says, not the fear of humiliation of the slaves, but that of the children, the fear and awareness, lest we would be deceived by the ancient serpent, namely the crafty ego, to fall and perish, and bring grief to the heart of the Father. So there is this distinction between the two, and it's important to understand this because there are Christian traditions that paint God as this harsh master, and that God essentially is this vindictive personality that must take revenge and must punish in order to establish his presence. Right? This doesn't have any sort of grounding or support from our tradition, and it's easy to kind of take from that God is this fearful being. Like Job, for example, when he goes through all of the suffering that he goes through, his mind automatically goes to this program where God is this deity that I must appease. So basically, Job's righteousness, it's all this this kind of transactional piety, where he does things to appease God, to avoid his wrath. He even offers sacrifices on behalf of his children, just in case they might have blasphemed here or there. You can read it in the prologue, in the beginning, in the first couple of chapters. He says that just in case they blasphemed, he offers sacrifices on their behalf. And his whole dialogue with the three friends, and then the fourth friend who is there all along also, it's all about trying to figure out why. Why is it that God would do this? I've done everything right. I've lived a righteous life. Why would God do this? In his mind, that it's righteousness equals safety, equals prosperity. And if I'm righteous, I'm expecting prosperity. If I get suffering, then something is wrong. Either God, he's well-intentioned, but, mistakes happen, or he doesn't care. And this is really, or God is not fair. He's expecting justice at every moment in his life. And when he doesn't find this, when his image and idea of God is not fulfilled, then he's very shocked, like, how could this be? And I lived my entire life being afraid of God and doing things in a way to kind of keep that fear or the realization from happening. Like, I don't want God to be angry with me and punish me. And then bad stuff ends up happening anyway. So what's going on here? So he's all confused and things don't make sense, and then he's confronted by God. And when he's confronted by God, his suffering and his understanding of suffering and his view of God, all of these are transformed. Before he was submitting. He was submitting to God because he wants to appease God and keep the suffering away from him. Because in his mind, God, if you don't do the right thing, if you don't say the right thing at the right time, God is an angry, vindictive God, and he's going to punish you. He's going to hurt you. So I want to, keep him happy, keep him, satisfied. So I'm not going to say anything to upset him because of that. But his whole relationship with God is transformed. And at the end, he's confronted with the fact that all this suffering and the reasons behind it and his push to understand really was all about, this unwilling submission to God. But at the end, he surrenders completely and is completely open to the presence of God, and he understands God as not being this vindictive, punishing deity, but God is in fact this mystery, this great mystery. And when we, he's so much bigger than, than our human capacity for justice can comprehend. So there is a huge difference between fear based on the knowledge of danger and fear as in awe of God.
Thank you.
And by the way, the Bible, describes God in human terms. So when the Bible talks about God, for example, God repenting, describing things and actions in human terms for our sake, for our understanding. And this is not something that is, an innovation or something that we're pushing on the Bible. This is what our fathers taught us. Even the Desert Fathers, St. Anthony talks about the anthropomorphisms of the Bible and how the Bible gives us this revelation of God in human language so we can understand for our own benefit. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Karas?
Thank you, Buna. I think it was it's really important to have that reminder. It's easy to slip even as we grow up into the kind of thing that you were explaining before, where we trust God with the great little things in our lives, and when it comes to the big things, even though He's gotten us through things time and time again and troubles time and time again, it's easy to fall back into the old system where we trust Him with the little stuff, and the big stuff we have to kind of relearn to trust Him with those things. So thank you.
Magid?
Thank you, Abuna. You mentioned don't be afraid of just being yourself and being different. I think our youth face a challenge to conform. I'm not talking about conforming to the world, but conforming to the culture of the society within the church. What do we say to the youth to stay in peace? How do they differentiate between variable, unstable culture and actual religion that is Christian?
I think the pressure is enormous on all of us to conform, to live a certain way. We're surrounded by expectations. We have expectations from our friends, our families, our parents, our community. We have expectations from God, and we need to evaluate these expectations, some of which are to be taken very seriously, like who God expects me to be, and some of it not so seriously, like maybe who my friends expect me to be. And I need to realize that things aren't stable, and what people expect me to be today, tomorrow will change. They'll expect me to be something else. And if I'm always living up to the expectations of people, I'm going to find things very unstable and very fluid and chaotic, and I'm just not going to be able to have any sort of stability or idea where I'm going in life, because I'm always living up to the expectations of others. And I think for us as a church community, it's very important to encourage this kind of courage, to live in a way where you're not careless about the expectations of others, in the sense that you're offensive to everyone, but at the same time you take things with a grain of salt, and you're always using discernment and evaluating things and testing all things. Not all things are created equal, and certainly not all expectations. So it's like being an engineer. We're taught to analyze and to think, and sometimes we overanalyze, we overthink. But in general, this is an important skill to think and to analyze. If something is helpful, we'll do it. If something isn't, we need to have the courage and the support, and knowing that our community will always be there no matter what.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabuna. I hope that we've covered all and give opportunity to all to share. If anybody has a final thing, or anybody did not have an opportunity to share, please unmute yourself and share with us. If not, well, that will be concluding. Abuna, one of the lovely thing, while I was actually trying to understand some kind of personality trait, I came across dictatorship, and one thing that really surprised me is the tool that they use to actually rule is to build a wall of fear in their pack's heart. Somehow they find that if you place that wall of fear, people will follow blindly, because fear, as you said, is such a vicious master. Whoever can control that will definitely rule. Thank you, Abuna, for that wonderful reminder tonight.
My pleasure, Abuna. There is a very interesting novel. It's non-fiction, actually. The Gulag Archipelago. It's about this 2,000-page book about the experience of this Russian political prisoner during the communist regime, and how fear, just like Kotsek was saying, how fear was used to control, to manipulate, to divide and conquer. Absolutely.
Yeah. خلاص بقى قدسك ابعتها لنا بقى one night كده, we're free to just one night, right? طب قدسك, can you conclude and bless us before we go?
Sure. If it's okay with us, I can just ask a final couple of questions.
تفضل.
Please no dad jokes.
I think Andrew knows you very well.
Whoever said this is in big trouble. I'm going to ask you the first question. What does Alexander the Great and Winnie the Pooh have in common? They're from Winnipeg, so you should know.
Yes.
Winnie the Pooh and Alexander the Great, what do they have in common?
They were both in a war?
It's a tricky question, Abu. Guys, do not be afraid of answering even if it is wrong, right?
Middle name.
Okay. When is that?
The kidnapping in the park? They woke him up. And fine, okay, this last one is a bit dark, so forgive me. Do you know why they put a fence around the cemetery? Why did they put a fence around the cemetery? people are always dying to get in.
This is really,
And on
really
that
good.
note, I want to thank Abuna and all the servants. Thank you so much for the wonderful opportunity and the blessing. Winnipeg has been my home for many years, and always look forward to being with Winnipeggers. And you guys are the best.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you soon in person.
We hope the same, Abuna.
Okay.
Can you just like pray for us, our Father, and like send us home?
In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, whom we hears, pray thankfully, our Father who art in heaven. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us the day our daily bread. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Jesus. Kingdom, the power, and the glory. Forever and ever.
Thank you, Abuna.
Thank you, Abuna. Thank you, everyone. And by the way, congratulations, Abuna, on your recent graduation. And it's tough to do everything online, I'm sure, and graduation online.
ربنا يخليك أبونا.
But when we see what's like here in person.
A nice gift بقى كده يعني أو حاجة.
Absolutely. No, not just a gift, but we'll have to celebrate in person.
Let us do that. Yes. Thank you, Abuna. Actually, you encourage me and you inspire me a lot through that program.
You're an inspiration to us all.
كتر خيرك.
Congratulations, Abuna.
Merci, Abuna. كتر خيرك.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, bye. Absorb us, Abuna. سلام.
Absorb, Abuna.
سلام.
Bye.